Hello, Ken Spriggs here with part 4 of my 3D printed 2001 Clavius dome base diorama build. And a lot of really good progress on this build. I left you off last time with the clay was already on and hardening. So I got that completely painted and the other outer machinery parts painted and put onto the base. And I also did some reworking of the dome slices or wedges, and I'll show you that here in a little bit. And they came out much nicer, and also got those all printed out, painted, or primered and painted as well. So just about completing the actual base in this build, and show you some really cool shots at the end. So let's go ahead and take a look. All right, so I've allowed the clay to dry for nearly 2 days now, just to let it fully set up. Some of the thicker parts, like the raised areas, take a little bit longer. And generally you can tell when they start to feel really solid, rock hard, as opposed to a little bit of flexibility. So getting ready to start painting the clay. So what I need to do is mask off this ring, and I'll just put some tape along the sides to mask off the black part of the framing, the wood, so that doesn't get painted either. I just want to paint the clay. And I'll try to avoid getting too much on this, but it doesn't matter. 5-minute epoxy will still stick to it nicely for the parts that I have to put down inside. So one other thing I did before that is, as I showed in the previous stills, I got in this really black paint called Black 3.0. And I've seen it by other people used, primarily Boyle Hobby Time, which I highly recommend. He does a really fantastic job in building his dioramas, but he often uses this to paint around the outer edges of his small dioramas because it's a really black paint. The way they advertise it is that it blocks the reflection of 99% of light, so it's the mattest, darkest black that you can get. And so what I did was I painted it down into just these sections right here, where you're going to see between the dome parts, just to give it the idea that that's deeper and darker. And you can already see it's still drying, but you can already see, so this is just to me a flat black on the sides of it. You can see it's considerably blacker and more matte than the other Tamiya. Doesn't reflect light as much. That has a little mark on it from my previous painting, which I can either touch up, or it probably won't be seen anyway with the dome over top of it. So I went around and I did that just in the areas where there would be an opening, just like I put that machinery in the area where there'd be an opening. I also painted this part of this ridge because my dome pieces are going to rest right inside this groove. There's a groove right inside of this part right here. In the original design, they're supposed to go down flat in another piece, which I showed in previous videos, that's like a spacer and it has a groove in it. But mine aren't going to go all the way down into the bottom. They're simply going to be, the edge of them is going to catch right inside of this groove and be glued in. And then I'm going to have some glue on this part here that they're going to rest on. Give them some stability. So, so I didn't want you to see this part of the ribbing in between, because you're going to see basically that. So I want it to be nice and dark. You're still picking up a little bit of gloss because it's still drying, but I might go over that again when I'm done. I want it to be really black so you don't see it at all. All right, so what I'm going to do is mask this off. I'm going to get an airbrush, the lunar base. I want it to be darker than this gray, which is going to match these outer panels in gray with weathering as well. But I don't want it to be this dark. This is a really dark gray. And it actually looks a little lighter on the camera, but it's pretty dark. So I'm going to bring that up quite a bit. All right. All right, so I used my vinyl cutter to cut out some templates that I could paint on these partial circles and also these lines onto the landing pads. You can make them out pretty well in some screenshots from the film. I don't know if those ones are square or not, but I thought I'd do something a little different. And of course the ones that are cut off, again, these are supposed to be the same length as this one, so I did partial lines as opposed to the full lines onto it. And what I used was I used Hall Red from Model Air, Vallejo Model Air. One, I wanted it to be dark. I don't want it to be bright red. They're also going to be kind of faded. Thank you, Mr. Compressor. They're going to be faded. This isn't the final color of the of what these are going to be. I'm going to still mist over them with some light gray or some white to make them lighter, to make them more like this color here. So, all right, let me keep working on that. I just want to show an example. So here's a set that I have down. I'll pull that up. Here's my template. It's very nice. And I just created these circles and lines myself. I didn't have anything to go by, so I think they turned out really cool. All right. All right, and here is the finalized weathered landing pads and machinery and the lunar surface. I got all the parts glued down. And as you can see, I faded down those landing circles and put some more, I airbrushed a little more dark gray inside of it first and kind of around it to give it that idea of the scorched landing pad. I may still go back with a little more, we'll see, but I think it looks really good right now. And I like the lunar surface, how that's looking. It's a little patchy. It's a little darker gray than the rest of it. And the idea with this is it's a lot of grays, obviously. It's all gray, so it has to be very subtle so that there's some variations between them so that, you know, it looks more, it's not all one color. That would be kind of bland. You want it to be some other colors within it. And of course, I'm still going to have the dome on here. That's going to be the same color gray as this. And I'm going to have the lights in the middle and the ship in the center. That's going to add some color with the red cockpit lights that you're going to see right up on the top. So, all right. But I think those turned out really nicely. They look nicely weathered. And you definitely want to put on things like the markings or the circles, the landing circles, before you do any weathering, because they would have been worn down from use. So you can see a few of them, like this one's still a little bit red. It's not quite as worn down as the other ones. So it gives us some contrast, some smudges here and there. Give it that idea of spaceships landing on this and wearing off that marking over time. So, okay, so this part is done for now. What I'm going to do now is start working on the Aries, the Stargazer Aries, and trying to figure out how to attach it onto the base. So I'm going to start working on that now as well. All right, so I'm working on the Aries model, the Stargazer 1/144 scale kit. And this has an interior. It has a passenger section. It has a cockpit, which I believe I showed in the previous images. And I'm going to be lighting it up. So I want to be able to, well, I have to have wiring coming down out of the ship, down through the base, so I can power it with batteries. Because it's way too small to put its own batteries inside of it. It would just be too tricky. So, but what I also need to do is support it by, you know, a tube, a brass tube coming up out of the base, which I can run the wiring through. So what I ended up doing is I took that center part back out right there, because it was a little too thick. There was some raised panels on it, and I wanted to be able to rest it onto a tube, a styrene tube preferably. And I was looking at metal as well. Metal's a little harder to work with. The biggest styrene tube that I could get was a 1/2 inch, which is this right here. So it was just slightly too big, and it wasn't going over top of it. So I took that piece out. I drilled a hole through the center. I put a brass tube through it, as you can see, and 5-minute epoxied it inside and up here as well, so it's nice and sturdy. And there's a wire coming up through, and all that is there is a disconnect, so that this can be one independent unit, and then I can have the other end of that plug down in the part that supports it, which would be this. So this goes right over top. Sorry for the focus. Get in there. And it slides nicely down over it. I had to sand quite a bit to get that to fit, but it fits nicely over top of it. Now it's not going to be this long. This is going to be cut off quite a bit, and then this tube is going to be glued onto a thinner brass tube. It's on there pretty good now. There we go. So it's going to be cut down quite a bit, just enough to slide over top of this, and then the other part that clicks into this, which would be this piece right here, female end. So these two will click together, and then this part will go down through this tube, and then the other part that'll be glued onto a much thinner tube, brass tube, probably with 5-minute epoxy, or even epoxy sculpt. I can use that to really shape it around it and make it nice and solid. And then, so this will be on a piece of post. It'll go down into the base, and then the ship will just plug into that plug sticking out of this, and then rest onto this. So this will be removable, so I can take it off while I'm transporting it. All right, so I think that looks pretty good for now. So what I want to work on now is getting a hole drilled down through the base and positioning the brass tubing that I'm going to be using, and kind of see how that's going to work. All right, so I drilled a hole down through that bottom ribbing part, and I did it up towards the top, but I took it straight down so that this tube is vertical. It's going up and down. And I did that mainly because I wanted it to be the strongest, and it's just loose right now. It's not glued in place, of course. But I wanted it to have the greatest strength because it's going straight up. If I took it from this way and it came out, it's going to droop. And if I took it from the bottom up at an angle, it's going to tend to fall down that way from the weight of the ship. So the idea is that then I went ahead and I put a bend in it so that the bend is coming straight up from the angle going down here, which is about 45 degrees, give or take. And so the idea is that the ship is going to be in this orientation. It's going to be up over the landing pad, but it's going to be up above the dome, and it's going to be sticking out in that direction. All right. So then I'll be able to attach that onto the tube that's going to go over top of that center piece, and have a connector in it for the wiring, which is going to go down through the tube, down out through the bottom, or the back actually. So, all right, come along pretty good. All right, so here's the finalized part that I ended up with to attach this tube onto the brass tube. And what this piece is right here is this little cap that I saved from something. I save all the little bits and pieces of things that I have that I might use on a model at some point, but this was a perfect shape. And I just cut out a hole, obviously, to be able to fit the tube through it. And I put another piece of tube inside of it to give it some strength. And then I just used 5-minute epoxy and put it all together. So that's on there nice and solid. So now this just goes right over top of that, and it supports it. So I can run the other wiring through here and meet it with the female end, and then connect those two together, and then just slide the ship onto this tube. And this will all be painted light gray, obviously. So, all right. All right, so in those previous shots, I put the ship up on it with all 8 of the dome pieces in order to kind of get an idea of its positioning and how it looked. But as you could see in the previous shots, it occurred to me that the dome was just not open far enough, and that pretty much the ship was about to crash into it. Because it wasn't that far up, and the dome was still further up. So what I did was, I went back and I redid the, I recut the panels. Now let me start from scratch. So I had mentioned in previous videos that the original wedge, there's only one of them. You just print it 8 times. I had put it into Prusa slicer, and I sliced off probably about a good inch or 2 off the bottom, so that it would be close to about halfway open. So this is one of the pieces that I had originally cut and printed. So I cut off the bottom. This is actually much longer. In fact, from what I never printed it the full size. From what I understand, if you have it in there, it's going to come out and it's going to look almost closed. There might be a slight difference in the slight gap between them, but it's going to be virtually closed, which, now that I think of it, isn't really very practical, especially since you have a landing platform that has holes in it for lighting. Why would you do that and then not be able to see any of that? So, but looking at this now, these are still too big, because how close I have the ship to this, these would be much further opened up. So what I did was I put it back in and I cut it even further. So this is one of the current pieces that I now have, and you can see if I put that on there, I cut probably another inch or 2 off of it. So none of this is on there now. And what I also did is, the way that I had this positioned, it was flat like this, well, flat kind of like this, and it was angled over. Now, the problem is I had quite a bit of failures with some parts that didn't print, and I showed that in previous videos on some of the other ones. But what I didn't realize is a lot of it had failed. You can see how thin this is, and there's not a lot of detail on the sides. That little bit right there, you can kind of see where there's an opening, but it didn't really print very well. So what I did with these ones is I tilted them further up, and I sliced it so that it has more of a sharper angle. And 2 things. So first of all, these took about 5.5 hours to print, the original one I was doing. These These ones took about 10 hours because they're higher up now. But I was able to put 2 on a plate since I made it smaller. And look how much more detail printed on the side of that. That is beautiful. I mean, look how much thicker that dome wedge looks. Much more accurate. No failures at all. And I was able to print 2 at a time. Even on the inside, there's no detail really, except there's a few lines. But even that pretty much worked out. But that is so much nicer and much better looking. So now when I put these down in, they are they're already opened. So when you look from the top, this whole pad is open. So even if these were continuing to move, which they are, this is already plenty of room for the ship to come down, because the ship really is just down in the middle and not have any problem. So much happier with those. You can see now from the side profile just how much hardier those look, how much thicker they look. So much better detail and really no failures. So I have 2 different prints. Pardon the train in the background. I have 1 more on the printer right now, which will be done later tonight, and then I'll just have to do 1 more because I'm doing 2 at a time, and I'll have all 8 of them, and they'll be far superior than the originals. So I'm much happier with that. That and the fact that the originals, let me get one and I'll show you real quick. All right, so besides the fact that none of the originals were thick enough and were correct enough, you had things like this where pieces just broke off, and this is even one of the better ones, little chip there. But then you have ones like this one, which clearly there's a big old chunk which didn't print right. In this one you have 2, you have a big old chunk out of there, 1 over there. So these would have taken a lot of repair. And even these are even thinner, where none of that opening survived the printing. And it had to do with the fact that these ones were angled down like this rather than up. But the thing about resin printing is that it doesn't matter how wide or how much of an area in the build plate the part takes. It matters how high it is, because it has to print each layer 1 at a time. So the higher up it is, the longer it takes. So that's why when I tilted these ones up so that these ones were more like this, it took twice as long. But at the same time, a lot less chance of any failure, because everything is printing upwards from a supported bottom, because I have no supports on these. They are simply flat. This whole edge is flat on the build plate, and it just prints up from there. But I'm really happy with these. These are quite beautiful. I really like how that detail. I'm glad I tried that. Well, I had to, because once I realized that the ship was just too close to the base at this point on the display for the base to be that far closed. So it's going to be much further out, and it's going to be looking a lot better. And then also when you look down, you can see kind of that rounded dome part. And these aren't glued in, obviously, or put in the right positions where they're going to be, but they're a lot better than the other ones were as well, because they all came out and printed well. They did not fail. So that's going to be pretty awesome. All right. All right, so I have detailed 4 of the newer dome slices that I printed. I think they came out really, really cool. Use a load of styrene strips, styrene sheets, some tubes, cut it up. I'm able to get some direct sunlight coming in through my balcony door here. So that makes it look kind of cool. See the rest of it in shadow. So later on today, I'll go ahead and work on the other 4. But for now, I want to go ahead and get a coat of primer on these, get a kind of an idea of how those are going to look. I think they're going to look pretty sweet. So let me go ahead and get some primer down and get a better idea of what they're going to look like. All right, and there they are with primer on them. Looks really, really awesome. Definitely brings all the detail together. It looks really a lot more detailed. And I like how those are going to stand out as being the main focus, which is what I would want anyway for the dome, because they have a lot more detail on them than the surrounding info, surrounding lunar machinery. Now there's some more detail in this machinery, of course, but as an overall surface, those look really detailed and pretty sweet, so pretty awesome. And those are finally painted. Once I get them painted to match that ring, the dome's really going to stand out and look pretty awesome. All right, and then there are the other 4 dome wedges, detailed with styrene. I haven't primered them yet. I tried to randomize them and add some different shapes and keep them kind of unique so they would stand out, so they wouldn't look boring and repetitious. All right, so that's all of them. So obviously those ones in the back are primer, these ones are not. So let me get a coat of primer on these, and then once those dry, I'm gonna go ahead and start painting the domes and get the final painting on them. And that'll pretty much finish this outer part of the Clavius dome base. Obviously, I'm still gonna have to put in the landing pad and the lights and finish up the control panels, the control rooms at the end. But other than that, that'll pretty much finish this outer part. And then I can start focusing again on the Aries, the Stargazer Aries, and get that post in place and get that ready to attach and wire that in as well. All right. All right, so as I showed in the previous stills, I first went ahead and used some neutral gray from Vallejo, and I just went over all the different raised pots all over it. That way it'll give it some depth and some character. And then after that, I went over it with some Tamiya. Get that a second. Royal light gray. This is the same gray that I used in the same colors that I used on the outer ring to get it the color that I wanted it to be, because I want these to match the outer ring. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and bring them back up again with some white. Let me show you here. All right, so it's very close. You can still see a little bit too much of the darkness in there, so I'm just going to lightly mist on some white, compare it to the outer ring, and go around and do all the parts until they all look the same, and then I'll finish up the dome here. So, all right, and I'm just going to use some Vallejo Model Air white as well. All right, so there are all of the wedges painted. Now they're not glued into place, so some of them are going to be a little higher up than they're supposed to be, or a little lower. I will have to get them all into place. I'm thinking about some type of a jig where I can have something that fits in the center and comes up and meets the points, so I can make sure the points are all the right height. That's the important part. I can eyeball it so it's centered in the middle of this area, but getting the points to be all the same, that's what I need to end up doing at the end. And of course I'll put 5-minute epoxy down in where that edge meets, and also on this edge here where that part's going to meet, and it'll be nice and solid. I'll have it in there solid. But if I have some kind of a jig where there's a post coming up around each of these points to the right height, I can make sure that those are all even, so I don't have to worry about eyeballing them as I go. But I think those turned out really nice. You can see they're definitely a lighter gray than the outside landing pads and machinery. They're just slightly lighter than the ring here. I may go back and just airbrush some white over that, just ever so lightly, we'll see. Or I may leave it as it is, because really this ring here would get a lot of the regolith or the moon dust up onto it, since it's a stationary thing. And you know, if it got dust on it and they're wiping it off, it's going to look dirty or that kind of thing. Very unlikely the dust is going to get up onto the dome. It's up here pretty high, so I don't think that would be a problem. But I like how those look in comparison to the interior, which definitely looks darker now. You can just make out the one lab back there in the back. I think I'm going to have 3 in the end, and you'll be able to see them. When you angle different angles, you'll be able to see it like I'm doing right there. So that'll be kind of cool. But I really like those. That turned out really nice, and adding the extra detail and getting those painted really made a big difference. So those are looking pretty fantastic. Can I give you a slow pan around here? All right, so it definitely brings out the darker lunar surface compared to the dome that's in the middle of it, and the landing pads. Everything's gray, of course, but there's enough of a contrast that I think that looks pretty sweet. And then I have the landing pad just sitting in there in the middle with the lights on. Kind of give you the whole effect. Kind of do it on the side a bit. There you go. Sorry for the noise. I have a fan coming in over here from outside. All right, fantastic. So I won't be ready to glue these on permanently until I get all of this done. Those back observation areas done, and everything all ready to go as far as that's concerned. And also getting the post in here for the ship and painted, because once I get these on, I'm not really going to be able to work down in there very easily. So I definitely want to wait till all that's completed before I get these dome parts glued on. All right, looking incredible. All right, so one last shot. I just kind of mocked up the ship there to kind of give you an idea of how that's going to look. Much better now with the doors far open, much further opened up. It's believable that I can get down there on the landing pad. And get a couple angles here. Very, very cool. And of course that post is going to be painted light gray to kind of blend in with the rest of it. But you'll be seeing it from this direction, so you're really not going to see it that much. And here's kind of a straight on shot from it. Kind of the reverse shot that we see in the film. The only time we see the ship in the same frame as the dome is from the reverse shot. We're looking up through the dome wedges, and we see the ship coming down from a far distance. So that's kind of the reverse of it coming down through those. So, all right, but looking fantastic. All right, so that's going to wrap up this part of my build for my Clavius dome base. I'm really happy with the progress that I've made. I'm really glad that I went back and reprinted those dome wedges. They turned out so much better and a lot thicker and more realistic. And then the detail that I added with the scratch building, I think looks fantastic. And now, especially now that I have them painted, and you can see how those look all together on the actual dome base. And so coming along fantastically. I will be then working on the Stargazer Aries to get the interior completed and get that lit up. and paint the exterior as well. And getting really close to finishing this up. I should be able to finish this up in the next video and then get that mounted onto the actual base, get everything all glued and all the lights and the batteries put into it. So really happy with how this is turning out. I did want to mention, and I really don't mention this much, and I'm not just trying to get you to check out my other things, but I do have an Instagram, not channel, but an Instagram account, and I also have Facebook, and I post a lot of my images throughout the week as I'm building onto Instagram and also onto Facebook. Instagram is just my name, Ken Spriggs. And Facebook, I belong to several groups on there that are dedicated to 2001 and building the Aries and that kind of thing. So I can post some links in my video here in the description if you want to check those out, get a little bit of sneak peek ahead of time of some of the things that I'm building before I post it on my YouTube channel. And I know some of my subscribers are certainly viewing on there as well, but I don't really mention it very often that I do have those other social medias that I post pictures and information on also. So, all right, so check that out. And I should have this all completed in the next video. Thank you to all my new subscribers, and stay tuned. I will see you all next time.